My name's Ian Ashbridge. I'm partner with Bidwells farm management team. I work out of Oxford and Cambridge and cover an area that goes pretty much from east to west. Delighted to welcome you all here today to this webinar. It's an interesting topic. It's a broad topic. It's a topic that we probably don't know the answer to, not necessarily find the answer to, but worthy of discussion. So I will introduce our panel in just a second, but wanted to start with putting our topic into context, which is the positive unintended consequences of the COVID crisis. Now, I don't need to remind anybody on this call just how serious this event has been in our lifetimes, something which most of us probably imagined we would never see. And it probably is not an exaggeration to say that the world has changed, life has changed. We've all had to experience a totally different way of living and working, particularly working, over the last 12 months, and particularly if you're operating your own business. It's been in a risk environment that no one ever imagined they would have to tackle. So while we're all reeling from the last 12 months and with the hope and positivity that we're coming out of the darkness now, it leaves us in a position of considering what now for farming and rural businesses. How have things changed for these businesses, for us as professionals and for our clients? And it seems to me that it's all about decision making. So it's always been hard enough to make decisions in a rural business context. And for that reason, there is a whole phalanx of professional advisors representing different levels of specialism that are available to help. The state doesn't do that in this country. It's a private sector thing. In other countries, you can go to, particularly France, you would go to the state for all sorts of advice. And you would actually probably have fewer options, so the decisions are less complex. However, decision making has always been the hard point. There are tax considerations to almost everything we do. There's private wealth considerations. There's what's right for the farm, what's right for the family, the changing policy and financial environment around you. And so that probably has just got harder as a consequence of COVID. And that's what we think we might explore in this discussion today. So I'm delighted to introduce our panel, and I'm going to introduce first Coral Little from Bidwells. Coral is a rural surveyor, and she focuses on valuation and compulsory purchase, but more often providing advice to landowners on a national and a local scale on traditional, what we call rural development diversification, and how you actually make ideas happen within a planning policy framework and other structures. I can't say next to her because it will only be next to her on my screen, but nevertheless, I'm delighted to introduce Vicky Hernandez, who is a partner at Royds, Withy, King. Vicky has been in this specialising in agricultural property law for more than 10 years, and she's recognised an expert in this sector. She contributes to Farm Diversity magazine and has spoken at the Farm Business Innovation Show at the NEC in Birmingham, which we hope will return in physical form probably next year. So Vicky's going to think about the legal implications when refocusing your strategy on renovation property, buying, selling land, seeking planning permission and so on. And then we have two panelists from James Cooper Kreston, Stephen Barrett. Stephen started his career with the Inland Revenue, or I should say H&M Revenue and Customs these days. It says here, but left the department because he wanted to devote more time to working with people to manage their tax and wealth. Stephen is qualified both at the Chartered Institute of Taxation and the Society of Trusted Estate Practitioners. And next to him in my screen is Jess Curley, who is Assurance and Audit Manager at James Cooper Kreston. I'm delighted to say Jessica did the same undergraduate degree as me at Cirencester, it says here, so she's eminently well qualified and has been with the firm since 2011. So Stephen and Jess are going to look at general tax planning, succession matters, and some more practical business management advice like cash flow planning and dealing with funding issues. So that having set the scene, we felt the most useful way to structure a discussion in this area was to present a case study, which I'll introduce in a second. And this will give us something that is hopefully relatable to all the people on this call that we might begin to talk around, rather than each panelist doing a set piece of what they want to discuss. However, before that, we have, and throughout this webinar, we have a poll of a series of questions we'd like your responses to. There is no right answer to any of these. We'll put them up on the screen for a few minutes. I think you have the opportunity to choose an answer. and we'll argue that it constitutes a scientific result and a movement of opinion. So the first question, please, Victoria, is going to come up now, which is how has COVID changed your outlook? It's deliberately a broad question. Interpret it, please, as you wish. Has life perhaps not changed? I've met many clients, particularly farmers, who would consider they've been relatively unaffected actually by what has happened around us. For others, the world is fundamentally different, and we must recognise that there may be people in this webinar and certainly out there in the wider world for whom COVID has entirely changed their lives and may have lost loved ones as part of the pandemic. So this is by no means a flippant question, but please answer it as you feel best reflects your personal views. Now, I think that's probably been there long enough, Victoria. Do you think we can remove that question, and I will go straight into our case study? So, okay. So we already have the results of that poll. I think I might address that later, as we started a little bit later. We've got further questions to come. Let me give you our scenario. Okay, so there's a farming family. They have potential agricultural, residential, commercial opportunities. COVID-19 has made them take stock of their options and realise that it's time to make some decisions and to do perhaps something different with those assets. They can't ignore the fact, nor can any farming business, that we now know the direction of travel for direct payments over the next 7 years, and we have little detail on the environmental land management scheme. So there's no doubt that the farming income side of the business will be part of these considerations. So they're having a look at various opportunities that might be out there. We've all heard stories, we've all had to not go abroad for a year and therefore take whatever holiday pleasure we might in the UK. And many people expect that as a trend to continue. So understandably, our farming family are thinking about diversification opportunities like holiday lets, event venues, farm shops to try and ride the crest of that wave. Now, they're going to look for advice. And we said there are three sort of principal sources of advice represented here. There's a surveyor, there's a lawyer, and there's two accountants. And so we can probably all relate instances in client businesses or instances we've seen where one particular consideration has prevailed in decision making and has not necessarily entered in the right consequences. Sometimes the tax tail wags the dog in lots of decisions because people are very focused on capital taxes. What we're suggesting here with this case study is we bring to bear lots of different points of view and perhaps actually a variety of advice is what is needed. So we've got our farming family, they're considering their options. I think it's probably time to see if this is something that our panelists recognise. Would anyone like to come in? Do you have clients in a similar situation that you'd like to illustrate for us? I should say you're all on mute before you go any further.
Thanks, Ian. I've unmuted, so hopefully everyone can hear me. We've recently come across someone who has a suitable site and is looking to set up a glamping enterprise with two other people, because one of the other people has a catering company and one has the glamping tents. And this idea wouldn't have probably even been thought about if it hadn't been for COVID and the increase within the UK holiday demand.
Okay. Would anyone else like to come in here on our case study in general terms? It's hopefully it's something that's familiar. What do you think is the most important thing that these people need to consider before they take any action? Stephen, perhaps, would you like to just come in?
Well, I think it's very difficult to say one critical thing. I think that's why it's such an interesting case study and why professional life is as interesting as it is, Ian, that there isn't a single factor, there isn't a single answer. It all rather depends upon the individual family and circumstances. So it might be the generation of income to replace falling farming profits. It might be asset preservation in terms of securing inheritance tax reliefs. It might be structuring something for the sale of an asset to generate capital gains tax relief. It could be a whole range of things, but typically it would be sought to be done in a tax efficient way to preserve existing tax reliefs and actually minimise income tax on any additional income.
It's going to be more than one of those things, almost certainly, isn't it? And therefore, how do you answer these multiple questions? Finding the answer to one thing may only raise others. We've actually got some sort of relatively structured questions for you about this case study. So I'll put the first one to you in a second. and we might just go around the houses and see what the different professionals' points of view are. I think we just might have the second poll question now, please, Victoria, if we may, which is going to come up on your screens very shortly. So thinking of our case study, our farming family who are considering their options, have you considered diversification opportunities for your property or income? And we mean this in the broadest sense. Diversification doesn't necessarily mean opening a farm shop. It doesn't necessarily mean selling milk direct to the public, for instance. It might mean anything, even within the farming context. For instance, on one farm I work with, we've begun to open opportunities by growing forage maize into the livestock sector. That's an entirely internal farming element of diversification. So please feel free to answer this as broadly as you wish. It doesn't mean have you opened a farm shop this week. Okay, thank you, Victoria. Let's pop that question to one side now and go into the first of it. So, like most family farming businesses, our case study family have got some land, they've got some buildings, they've got a diversity of assets. They're only really exploiting it for a farming purpose at the moment. There'll be some older buildings, there'll be some newer buildings, there'll be all sorts of things. How do you think our landowners should diversify their portfolio of enterprises? Where might they go first from farming using the assets they've got? Coral, should we start with you and then bring in some other views? What do you think?
Happy to. So for anyone who's considering diversifying, the first thing I would suggest that they do really is decide what they want to achieve. Now, this might seem like skipping a step or two, but I'm not talking about the final goal. You don't need to know what you want in 30 years' time, but it's good to have a steer. And if you work back, and it can be something as vague as bringing a building back into use or making sure that you've reached break even within a year of whatever it is you want to do. What this first important step does is it provides you with a direction, and from there it is key that you can then move forwards. The family in question here have a range of assets, and whilst it's important to have a strategy, they can now start to think practically, and there are lots of options the family can look at, but what they need to take into account are the practicalities, as Stephen alluded to earlier. So what can the assets be used for? Will they require additional staff or machinery, advisors or knowledge? What are the family's interests? Will funding be required? What about permissions, authorizations, licenses or permits? The list goes on and on. But one final key thing is how the concept will actually function in practice. From this, the family can figure out what may or may not be viable. Some things may require more investment up front, others may be a more easy, natural transition. As we are all aware, COVID has had a huge impact on all of our lives over the last year, but it's also brought about change from the mindset for many, and this has created opportunities that the family may wish to consider. Community, local and family are all buzzwords at the moment, and they seem to truly reflect the trends we have seen grow and develop. Examples, as Ian has mentioned, holiday lets, where demand for cottages and farm stays have reached new levels in the last 12 months. Some websites have seen a 300% increase in booking numbers, and given the rising number of COVID cases in Europe, it seems like this will only continue to grow over summer. Farm shops are another example. Over the last year, more and more people have taken an interest in where their food comes from and how it is produced. Lockdown has perhaps focused this way of thinking, and 92% of farm shops across the country have seen an increase in profits over the last year. 79% are now offering click and collect services, while 60% go further and offer delivery. If the family here were to set up a farm shop, one of the most important things for them to consider will be planning. Interestingly, the answer to the age-old question of will I need planning depends entirely on what the farm shop will be selling. If it's produce directly from the farm, then planning permission may not be required. If instead they intend to buy the majority of their products in and sell them on under the cover of farm and rural, then it's likely planning permission will be required.
It's interesting, isn't it, that a farm shop now would look quite different to a farm shop idea of 10 years ago. Now it is not necessary to have busy people standing behind a counter selling things. People have had to adapt and innovate over the last year, and I've seen some really interesting, essentially farm shop vending machines where you can buy extremely high quality products, but you don't have to come into contact with people in the farm shop. Now, I'm not saying that's the world that we want to live in. Hopefully, some human contact will be a regular part of our lives again. But it does mean that what we thought of as the farm shop diversification and everything that's entailed a few years ago is quite different now at the end of Q1 2021. So planning beautifully addressed. As always in this country, there is going to be a planning issue to face. There's also going to be a tax issue. Stephen, can we come to you at this stage for your thoughts on the first question?
Well, as we've talked, as we were preparing for this seminar, the tax answer is always, it depends. It depends upon the family situation, the sort of objectives that they've set working with Coral, and what their longer term plans are. I think the key for me, Ian, is ensuring that the tax rules are used to best advantage and don't become an obstacle to achieving what the family wants to achieve. And particularly in my mind, Ian, the key thing is this distinction between an asset that's used in your own trade and an asset that's used in somebody else's business that you allow them to use for instance, for payment of rent. The tax analysis on those two different assets is very different. If it's used in your own trade, then you would benefit from very valuable inheritance tax and capital gains tax reliefs, whereas fundamentally let assets will not generally qualify for inheritance tax reliefs. I mean, there are exceptions to this, there always are in tax. I mean, let agricultural land benefits from agricultural and some CGT reliefs. And if you're running a business which is fundamentally farming, and then you introduce diversification in the form of rental activity, that itself will also be covered by the business as a whole, if it doesn't become predominantly non-farming. So the key thing from the tax advisor's point of view is looking at the strategy being worked on by Coral and the client, and then saying, well, how is this best put together to preserve the very valuable tax reliefs that the family currently benefit from, and what other tax reliefs might be available if things were done differently. And that could be capital taxes, but it could also be income tax, annual income tax on the profits that arise from the business and how those are shared around the family.
I suppose the extent to which the state has funded the management of the COVID crisis has meant that all taxation structures in this country are going to come under a great deal of scrutiny in the next few years as the deficit needs to be narrowed and the bill met. So I suppose actually the tax implications are even more pertinent now than focusing just on inheritance tax, for instance. I'm a little bit conscious of time, and I know you don't want to hear me talk, you want to hear the panelists talk, so I'm just going to put our next poll question up, which is, do you feel you understand the funding options available to you? There are some COVID related elements of government help available. I've had one client who's secured a COVID related grant, but money is as cheap as it has ever been at the moment, and while that's one good thing, it doesn't mean it's going to be cheap forever. So funding something through equity or through debt is an important thing to consider. So perhaps we'd just like to give it a yay or nay to this question while it's on the screen, and we'll look at all the results of these a bit later on, as I'd like to keep moving through the case study. So thank you for that, Victoria. We have identified that this family are almost certainly going to face a planning issue, and they need to think very carefully about that. There are going to be some tax implications, both income tax and capital gains tax, inheritance tax, that they need to think about. So probably the first piece of advice is have a plan, have a very careful plan before you spend any money or embark on any major decisions. So how, in relation to our poll question, how can this family understand the funding options that are available to them? We're at a point where there's fewer grants available now than there have been in previous years. We know something's coming around the corner. We don't know the detail of it. Coral, do you want to comment on funding options for some of the diversification projects you get involved in?
So thinking specifically about grants or funding to support the creation of something like a farm shop, there's unfortunately not a lot available at the moment, as you say, and there's lots coming down the pipeline, but it's not necessarily available in front of us. Had this question been raised a few years ago, the funding position would have been very different, and there was lots available through the Rural Development Programme for England network, more commonly known as the RDPE. This included things like leader grants, the growth programme, and the countryside productivity scheme, which you may have heard of. However, because this all came from the EU and Brexit has since happened, it's no longer available. The government have confirmed that there will be replacement funds provided, but as this will be through different schemes and arrangements, a lot of this is on hold as it is considered, debated and decided. But it is likely that it will reflect a great deal as to what's decided for the withdrawal of agricultural subsidies. Earlier this month, the government published the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which was a replacement funding flow. More information is expected on this later in the year, but it's likely that it will be managed through lead authorities, so councils, county councils, and this will focus on wider benefits such as sustainability, connectivity, and supporting rural communities. Given the lack of options, it might be worth the family here considering whether support be available through local environmental action funds or local enterprise partnerships. Both of these things tend to be incredibly competitive and very specific, and with the withdrawal of funding elsewhere, it's not a definite, but it is worth looking into.
So would you say the trend is towards sort of localism then, because we are a very centralised country compared to lots of others, and it's always been, you know, you can apply to the RPA or the ministry, as people would say, for this grant. Do you see it, from what you said, it sounds like actually a more local approach is likely to be the flavour of it in the future?
I think that's exactly what it's going to be. With sort of, as COVID has progressed, there's been that sense of community coming in. Obviously, there's regional differences and schemes, and as HLS come in, and well, not come in, but has been around for a while, and that was very much focused on wider benefits, but for particular areas. I think that is key, and it will flow through to these other schemes, and it's going to be interesting to see how they manage it and differentiate between them. So,
okay. Jess, do you want to come in here? Because when we prepared for this webinar, we talked a lot about almost it doesn't matter which pot of money you go looking for. No one is going to offer you a grant or indeed lend you money without a very, very sound business plan.
Yes. Oh, pardon me. Yes, of course. So following on from what Coral has spoken about, it is important to have financial plans in place and to spend time looking at how this diversification might work financially. Although a lot of what follows might be common sense, it is often not thought through thoroughly and carefully enough, and financial problems can arise. As Ian mentioned, when looking to obtain the funding and diversifying your business, it is crucial to have a business plan, including budgets and cash flow forecasts. If the diversification is funded by the bank, it is likely that they will require these documents anyway. These documents might also be an important tool when proposing and discussing the ideas with family members. The overall business plan will include ideas, market research, longevity of the project. How long will people be wanting these farm shops? How long will this UK holiday boom demand be in place? These business plans do not need to be complicated, and there are lots of good examples online, such as the Prince's Trust website have some really helpful items. Whereas the budget will focus on the financial information. When preparing the budget, we need to consider the threats which might be faced during the initial years. We need to identify the items which could and are likely to change, such as interest rates, wages, wage costs and business rates. Interest rates are low at the moment, but they could and are likely to rise. Could you look to fix these rates and other costs to control some of these variables within the budget? COVID specific, have the bounce back loan interest repayments been included into these budgets? Be realistic with your budgets. Somebody once told me a plan will often take double the time you think and sometimes double the initial cost. Once the budget has been established, it is then useful to apply some stress testing under different scenarios in order to understand how the business might cope if things don't go to plan, which we all know can often be the case. What happens if income reduces by 5–10%? What happens if insurance costs increase? How do these movements impact the bottom line of that budget? We also need to consider, as Coral mentioned earlier, where is that break-even point and when will it be achieved? As well as the financial budgets, and often more importantly, we need to prepare detailed cash flow forecasting. The majority of businesses fail because of cash flow problems rather than other factors. At the end of the day, cash is king. The farm shop can increase sales, it can grow, which is great, but you need to monitor the actual cash flow. Can the bank be repaid? Can the suppliers be paid? Can your wages be paid? In order to reduce the risk of cash flow issues, it's important that the cash flow forecasts are monitored against live, up-to-date data. And it's really important to do this as you go along and not at the end of each year. This enables decisions to be made depending on what that data shows and changes implemented there and then if required. That's probably everything on that matter.
No, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because farm budgeting tends to be done annually, so we rarely consider inflation. You tend to, rather than fixed cost expenditure from the previous year, because you know what the wage bill is and so on. Actually, you never really think about inflationary pressure, and it is real. But the other thing I see a lot of farmers do, particularly, is budget to profit and loss level and go, oh, lovely, I'm going to make this much profit. But of course, what the P&L budget suggests, it's all going to happen like that. And it doesn't. It happens in real time in a really messy way over 12 months. Or if you're an arable farmer, you'll be very familiar that having a lumpy cash flow, it takes years to reconcile.
Exactly.
So I'm talking a lot, and I talked to you. But one of the first things you mentioned in your response was the words family members. You know, that is often the spanner in the works. It's also often the seed of diversification ideas, because somebody will have spotted they can do something different with an asset. An asset that's currently tied up in the farming business, and all sorts of problems arise from that. I've got a client with what looks from outside a very dull asbestos-clad barn, which has got some of their great. Actually, what it's got with it is a wonderful timber framed structure. And, you know, they had a great idea to try and redevelop that as a beautiful building and as essentially a holiday let business. COVID will not have helped them at all, but it was a family-driven idea, and that brings us to a common theme that arrives in farming families, which is this issue of succession. And of course, one thing people never say, it doesn't have to happen. You're not obliged to do it. It's usually most people's objective is to hand on the farm, hand on the business in some way or another. So I think we have a poll question on this. Again, I think it's a yes or no answer, which is just have you considered your approach to succession planning? Do you want to pop that on the screen? Thank you, Victoria. And notice the question doesn't answer, have you successfully resolved your approach to succession? It just asks, have you thought about it? Okay, so let's move on. I mean, this inevitably brings us towards business structures and legal issues. And I'm conscious, Vicky, I haven't come to you yet. Would you like to just offer some thoughts on your experience with client businesses in this area? How can you avoid getting things in a real muddle if you want to hand bits on to children, grandchildren, and so on?
I think you said at the beginning, Ian, didn't you, that it's in agricultural families in particular, it can be really challenging to think about succession planning, and there are just so many different objectives, I suppose, lots of different family members, often with different sort of views on things. And I think sometimes the worst thing that can happen is we just put it off. It's just too difficult. Let's just get on with the day job and we'll worry about it another day. And probably, if anything, COVID has forced us really to face up to our mortality. And, you know, I've got a number of clients over the past 12 months who've been thinking and for years and years almost about what they might do and haven't done anything. And yet in these last 12 months, we have all got around the table and had some really frank discussions, and they're not easy, but actually been able to say, you know, this is what we've got. And so what are the options and what do we all want to do about them? And I think that's so important at the moment. It's what I found certainly over the last few months when we've been dealing with it is if you get the older generation and the younger generation around the table, you know, often the older generation have a preconceived idea about what the younger generation want. They have a really big overriding requirement to be fair, and that's incredibly difficult where you've perhaps got some children involved in the farming business who probably need the land to continue that in the future, other children off somewhere else in a different profession, and how do you divide assets and be fair to everyone? But what I have found in those families who are able to sit together and talk about things, actually the younger generation have their own ideas and they're not necessarily the same as the parents think they might be. We've also had people coming back into farming from the younger generations as a result perhaps of COVID, where they've wanted to come back and support the family. So I think it's the most important thing, you know, as a lawyer that I can say to anyone is talk about it, because once you've sort of faced up to the challenge, there are lots of there's the accountants, there's the lawyers, there's all sorts of people who can help you put things in place and do it properly. But the horror story, of course, is that you don't do anything. Somebody dies, you're not even sure if you've got a partnership agreement, you find one in the drawer, but not everybody's signed it. It doesn't reflect anything to do with what you've actually done in practice for the last 10 years. And that's a real muddle. And you really don't want to leave that for the next generation to try and sort out. So I suppose if you can do anything, is open the conversation. And from there, you can then start putting some sort of structures and planning in place.
It's hard enough once somebody's passed away. But the thing that I took out of what you just said was the danger of people thinking they know what someone else might want in families and making an assumption, and actually they might, unless you have those conversations, you can't be surprised by the answers, but you certainly won't resolve it if one party believes one thing about the other.
Yes. I think the laws become, well, the world has become more sophisticated. So, I do appreciate farming families. They don't tend traditionally to like lots of paperwork. You do things on a handshake. And unfortunately, that's just not the way it is now. And we do have to face up to and embrace that you might need a legal document. And it's not, as bad as it feels. But it will be so much worthwhile to, for the children and other family members in the future.
I mean, I would echo that, Vicky. I mean, I don't know if it's your experience as well, but we've been asked to look at cases where paperwork doesn't support the report that you're looking to put into HMRC. So the key documents here are the accounts, the annual tax returns, and the partnership agreement. And the revenue will typically ask for the partnership agreement and certainly the previous year's accounts to critique and audit whatever is submitted to them in the event of an IHT transfer into trust or in the event of someone's death. And I think it can be a false economy not to put those things in place and ensure that at every year, the partnership agreement and the partnership accounts actually are sitting side by side and all telling the same story, because at some point that story may need to be told and objectively assessed by the department.
I had a friend who not long ago joined the family partnership, and I saw him, this pre-COVID clearly, and said, "Oh, congratulations, Chris, on being made a partner." And he rather dryly said, "Yeah, well, you're congratulating me on now being responsible for a third of the debt." So there's sort of swings and roundabouts. But I wonder, can we just flash our next poll question up, because I almost thought I'd missed one, which is about tax implications of diversification and succession planning. The answer here, you'd have to be very confident to answer yes. I'd be quite interested in the responses. Let's pose a question about tax then. Should our farming family in our case study, they need to consider who currently owns these assets, because they may not even be within the control of those who wish to diversify. If I come to Vicky first on that, and then perhaps Stephen.
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, I suppose the next stage, once you've sat around the table and thought about what you would like to do for the future, is to think about how you structure it. And to a degree, tax is almost the most important thing here, because from an inheritance and capital tax point of view, you want to minimize tax as much as possible. But we're certainly seeing, from a legal perspective, perhaps more difficult or just more complicated structures coming in, because the end result is then better for people. So, for example, we're perhaps moving land which has traditionally been held by, two of the older generation into members of the younger generation's names, but perhaps with a trust that owns part of the land, with, to take income for grandchildren's school fees. There are various different ways of doing that. And we haven't really, in terms of diversification, talked about, I suppose, the other big thing that is open to farmers at the moment. And I think that is that the planning regime is such that there is now potential to perhaps sell off and develop land for housing, where in the past that the planning just wouldn't have been granted. So we are also, from a legal point of view, thinking about where we might move land, for example, into a limited liability partnership, because if we do then sell off that land, because that is an option for farmers. If it's not working, land can be sold for other purposes. But when we get the sort of the gain from that, it's got to have been structured right in the first place, so that the income and capital goes out to the right people. Stephen, you've probably got some more experience of that that sort of fits together hand in hand with my side.
Well, it's a really important point you make, Vicky, and certainly from a tax point of view, my concern always with clients is talking through the fact that one starting with an asset that might be inheritance tax free because of the agricultural property relief or business property relief, but before the signature's even dry, it's moved to becoming an asset which isn't relieved by any inheritance tax, i.e. cash, and it is a significantly higher value. And of course, depending upon where that happens during someone's lifetime, that can have a significant impact on the ultimate inheritance tax liability that might arise, because there may simply not, in practical terms, be enough time to carry out any planning after the event. So at that point, one would be looking to make transfers while the value is relatively low, and perhaps with the benefit of capital gains tax relief as well, and to ensure that even if something were to happen within the next 7 years, it's at that value rather than at the development value. So that's a really important point, as is doing any audit. I don't know, Ian, if I could just make a few comments about some other tax issues generally, and that's...
Please do, because you mentioned when we prepared for this that there are something like 30 consultations about to open. As you speak, I wonder if Victoria might just pop up the poll number 6, so that people considering your answers can just give to that. But yeah, no, please proceed as you suggested.
Well, I was just going to say, Ian, there are two things that are really important to bear in mind. One is that tax is complicated, and secondly, that things change over time. And it's so often that we're asked to provide advice when you look at what's happened over the last 20 years, when people may not even be around. You don't know who owns the tenancy, you don't know whether the land is in the partnership or not. If it is in the partnership, you're not sure who owns what. And it's very difficult to give any precise comment on what the tax position is at that point and what the future might bring. So I think it's really important periodically to carry out a tax audit of the farm. I alluded earlier, Ian, to where you take assets out of farming into non-farming, you may lose inheritance tax reliefs. That can happen almost without people noticing, because it makes good commercial sense, but there is always that tax implication that needs to be considered alongside it. And that may involve gifts of assets, it may incorporate a different structure, it may involve the use of a trust. But it's families going into those things with their eyes open and understanding where they're coming from and where they're headed from a tax point of view, to avoid those unpleasant surprises further on down the line.
Yeah, it's almost worthwhile having a set day a year where the documents are produced and reviewed and everyone's clear about what they say, because as you say, after a death or after a falling out or after a marriage even, it's often too late to unwind. It's a big muddle to put right. We've talked about our case study, and we've heard from Vicky and Stephen and Jess and Coral. I wonder, we talked about farm shops and things we're quite familiar with. What other market developments or trends do you see coming as a result of the change in our lives that COVID's driven? Are there in particular opportunities that this case study family with their collection of assets might benefit from? Who wants to go first? By all means, dive in.
I think one of the things, if I may, that I've been involved with a bit more is where we have farmland and maybe some redundant barns, or the potential effectively to develop buildings, perhaps for maybe office use, because I think there is this perception at the moment that people aren't going to keep wanting to go into the city, and maybe they're looking for a slightly different location and type of office building. So where I've had clients with sort of potential buildings, that's very much something that we've looked at, developing almost a letting of land that can be let. And that's useful too, if you're trying to divide up property amongst the younger generation, you can let somebody manage that side of things who doesn't necessarily want to actively farm land. So I think that's a trend we might see quite a bit more of, to be honest.
The office thing is fascinating. Someone said to me the other night, "Oh, that's it. We're not going back to the offices." And I just thought, we've all experienced working from home. We might not want to go back to Seacourt Tower necessarily, but there must be an alternative. Stephen, sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, I was going to just fly the tax flag again, in that it comes back to that point. Well, yes, if we bring somebody in who's maybe returning to the farm, or somebody growing up on the farm and looking to take responsibility for a new income stream, what is the tax position of that income stream from a capital gains tax and inheritance tax point of view. So it's always just ticking these things off, even if there's nothing to be done. I think it's being aware of the consequences. And one thing I'm also interested in is the whole sort of social attitude towards food miles and growing local. I've been involved in a number of conversations recently where people are perhaps thinking of setting up some type of small food hub where they get different small producers together on the farm. I think that's very exciting and may generate interesting opportunities. How you do that, whether it be through a joint venture or through a simple rental agreement, will be some of the detail to be talked through. But that trend may well go beyond the time limits of COVID.
It's interesting. Just before you started speaking, there was a question been posed in our chat on this webinar. When I think of a diversification, I can't say who it is because they haven't given their name. But when I think of a diversification, I think of opening a farm shop or building or a small holiday let. What other options are there for farmers? And we touched on development, and that's either a case of you're lucky or you're not. It just depends where your farm happens to be and where the conurbations are. But any other particular opportunities, examples within your client bases beyond the usual of diversification?
Mine probably follows on from Vicky's point, and it probably would have seemed bonkers saying this 50 years ago, but I think there's a real rise in the wellness centres and the farm gyms, farm barns converted into gym studios. And I think if the trend continues that people are moving out of the city and moving to the towns, and then from experience, you're working from home all day, all you want to do in your time to unwind is get out of your house and go somewhere else. And I think if anybody's got farms or buildings that are on the outside of a town or on the edge of a main road, I think it could be a really good opportunity.
I think it's clients developing exactly as you say.
Yeah.
A wellness centre. It will probably need to be some let office buildings to start with. But ultimately the ambition is for something much more. And it's only a workable idea because of the fact that it's on a farm, that it's rural, and it's somewhere people can find a space, peace, renewal, which they can't elsewhere. So it's really interesting that
and that's not from sort of personal experience or not from any clients, but I've just seen a shift in people after those sort of facilities.
It's really interesting. One of the valuable assets might be space and light and fresh air.
Yeah, some of these sort of farms where you can. Yeah.
And there may be then things that you can build around that attract people and give them something to do while they're there. And you could actually build something quite significant and helpful, not only from the point of view of family income, but also from the point of view of the local community.
Mm.
So I'm sorry, who'd like to come in?
That's a particularly interesting one in that it kind of flows back to a lot of people think of diversification in the sense of a farm shop or a holiday let. But if you can link that back to the more sort of authentic or holistic overview of agriculture and bringing in the diversification opportunities, which perhaps might not fit what you expect, but are still very valid options to consider, they might be moving towards sort of viticulture or growing pharmaceutical crops. It's not an entire transition or project change, but it's something ancillary that you could bring in or build on upon, perhaps.
That whole area touches on, in a sense, public goods. And the 6 pillars of environmental land management, particularly the ones about public access, heritage, clean air, rural businesses have potential to offer all those things. So while future subsidy structures may be hung around those pillars, they're there because people are asking for them, and there's a market there to fulfill. Is there anything else at this stage? Because I wanted to leave a little bit of room for questions. Is there anything that you panelists would particularly like to add? Any sort of closing thoughts on our case study family, or on more general experience of how your clients are thinking post-COVID?
I think if I could share one piece of it, or 2 pieces of advice rather, perhaps the first would be, as I said earlier, to actually have those difficult conversations and start thinking about things. But the second, which I think has been sort of illustrated by today, is that you cannot just get one professional advisor who will tell you everything. It really is a collaborative effort here, just to make sure that all bases are covered. So, if you can get your particular accountant and lawyer talking at later stages of a transaction, it has to be a round table effort, and that really will pay dividends.
I think from my point of view, it would be keeping on top of what is the tax analysis of the farm and keeping that under review, and also to flag. You mentioned consultations actually turned out to be a bit of a damp squib on Tuesday in terms of the announcements that were made affecting rural clients. But I think it's very important to recognise that COVID needs to be paid for, and tax will form part of that. And we live in a favourable, benign tax regime at the moment, certainly in terms of capital taxes. And I can only see that that's going to change for the worse, not for the better. I can't say when and in what way, but I think it's right to start thinking about what preemptive actions might be necessary and appropriate to avoid those tax changes down the line.
Where do you think that will particularly come? Do you think that will be an attack on agricultural property relief, or will it make business property relief more difficult to attain? Where might those changes come? Because I don't think inheritance tax constitutes a very large proportion of the Treasury's sort of tax take, does it generally?
No, it doesn't, but that's possibly, you could argue that's because it's so benign.
Right.
So just without making this a great technical lecture, I mean, the thing is there are different definitions as to what is a business for capital gains tax from inheritance tax, and the definition for capital gains tax is a much higher hurdle to meet so it could well be that those could be aligned. The government, I think, has recognised that the tax system actually distorts natural behaviour in that it encourages assets to be retained, because on death there's no inheritance tax potentially, and a capital gains tax free uplift as well. So there's very much thought about you will not be able to get a capital gains tax uplift on death. And if that is the case, then there may not be any disadvantage in tax terms in making lifetime gifts. So it's a really interesting situation. There are other areas as well that the government is looking at, but exactly what will be enacted isn't known. But I can't think it's going to be a better environment for taking action than the one we have now.
Right. Okay. So there you are, folks. You heard that loud and loud. There's only one direction of travel. Could we, at this stage, we've only got a few minutes left. Would it be a good opportunity to have a look at the poll questions and just sort of pull apart the answers? Perhaps the panelists would like to comment on them. Is that something we can see, Victoria? Yes, it is. Okay. So this was the answer to the first question. So 2/3 of people have done some thinking. We can conclude from that. And the next one, please. Okay, so actually most people, perhaps of those 2/3 of people who've been thinking about something, this is what they've been thinking about. Coral, Jess, Stephen, Vicky, what does that say to you? I wonder if these are people who've sort of got the inklings of some ideas, but perhaps not advanced them.
That probably reflects the number of conversations that we've been having with clients in the last few years. Originally, diversification was sort of the people that had the amenities immediately available to them and were proactive and thinking ahead. It now seems to be a much more generalised concept, and people want to consider, is it something I can do as a smaller step rather than jumping straight in at the deep end and going the full way?
Because 20 years ago, it was the answer, wasn't it? Farming's in crisis. We had two terrible epidemics of farming, and then a crisis that led to the Curry report, and the government's response was more or less, well, diversify. That's not the case this time round, and it was much harder for some people than others. If you're, for instance, farming 500 acres out in the middle of the fens, there's not that much passing public traffic for you to sell glamping to, and it may be possible, fond of the fens as I am, it may be possible there are more attractive locations to go to for your yurt or your shepherd's hut. Can we see the next question? Because I know there's a few more. Let's just whack them up. Okay, so pretty equivocal then about funding options.
I think it's interesting on the funding. I didn't say this during the webinar, but we found I think traditionally, farmers would go to the AMC for their loans, and they'd get a mortgage on the land, and that sort of was it. We didn't deal with the mainstream banks very often for agricultural land, and certainly from my experience, I've recently done a lot more transactions with different banks, with the mainstream banks, and I wonder whether sometimes you speak to the bankers and they say, you know, we've got this pot of money actually, it's earmarked for farming projects, but we're just not necessarily getting the applications in. You know, do you know any farmers who want to do something? Will you send them our way? And I wonder whether in answering that poll, people are actually aware, you know, that there are perhaps other bank options than there used to be out there at the moment, which you know, it's worth going to talk to people that you may not have bothered approaching, you know, 10, 20 years back.
And the next one, please, Victoria. Oh, so most people have considered it, but may not have had those difficult conversations. And the next one, please. I would imagine that's probably a fair reflection of that statement, is that most people have opened a discussion, but yeah, okay. So this suggests that our respondents are willing to address the issue, but need some help and advice to get there. Which of course is what we want to hear, isn't it? We're all professional advisors on this webinar. And the last question, please, Victoria. I think there is one more. Yeah, okay. So virtually hardly anybody thinks it's a blip and it's going to go back to how it was before. Yeah. And interestingly, a couple of people, you know, have really experienced dramatic change from this. Okay. That's wonderful. Thank you. We only got a couple of minutes left. Is there anything that you would like to offer as closing comments, panelists? Any more questions from anybody on the webinar? You can post it directly into the Q&A session. I think I dealt with the first one I saw. One of the questions I had for you actually, which was posed to me by a client only yesterday. We're doing a huge amount of countryside stewardship scheme work at the moment, mainly because some schemes we set up 5 years ago now are coming to the end this year, and certainly more interest because people now can quantify the decline in basic payment income and are seeking to offset that by countryside stewardship. Do you have any thoughts about that? And particularly the question that was asked of me was, well, what happens if I just put my whole farm into this? Bearing in mind that we have some farms that are managed with, you know, inheritance tax particularly uppermost in mind. Who wants to, it's sort of a legal and an accountancy question, but Stephen, do you want to, Stephen or Jess, who'd like to go first on that one?
Well, I'm happy to go. I mean, it's an interesting question, actually one that I was posed yesterday, so I'm about to start thinking about it, but I haven't been asked before. I think, so this is very much a sort of an initial thought, really, that I would be concerned about tax reliefs. I think my sense of it is that country stewardship benefits from being treated as farming income while there's an active farming activity going on, that once that farming activity is stripped away, that will just be viewed as relatively passive income derived from the ownership of land rather than any trading activity, in which case I think it could be susceptible to the loss of agricultural relief, business property relief, and that could have implications for the farmhouse itself. Now, it's interesting that this is a government-sponsored scheme, and through the discussions I have through CLA, what we're definitely trying to do is promote a tax regime that supports the public money for public goods argument. Now, so it remains to be seen how, if people are being encouraged to go into non-farming schemes, why shouldn't the tax system support that? But at the moment, without looking into it in any detail, I'm a little bit nervous about that as a proposition from a tax perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that it has been technically possible to accept basic payment scheme income, carry out no actual farming activities. That was perfectly possible, and yet you need to be a farming business, and indeed for a period of time an active farmer, to get the basic payment scheme income. So I see the argument that, I mean, I still feel there's an element of risk in countryside stewardship because you do have to fulfil some contractual obligations. There's an element of risk in that. You have got some real costs against it. You've got seed to purchase and cultivations to carry out and so on. But I suppose, like all these things, it will be decided by tax law, by case law, and it's just a matter of time until that's established and all those things come to pass.
Yes, I think if I were a zealot in the HMRC department, I'd be saying that the sort of things you described are managing the land rather than actually managing a business. But you know, as I say, that's something. Those are only initial thoughts. I'm going to be looking into this anyway shortly for my client.
Well, we are coming up almost to stroke to 1 o'clock, and having lost so much time early on, I'm going to try and bring this to a close on time. Thank you to all our panellists. Thank you to Jess Curley and Stephen Barrett from James Cooper Kreston, and Vicky from Royds, Withy and Coral from Bidwells. Thank you to everyone who's taken part in this webinar. We're all used to and to an extent tired of sitting staring at screens, so the fact you've given your kind attention for an hour is much appreciated. Any final comments from anyone, or should we draw the webinar there and wish everybody a chance to enjoy the rest of a sunny March afternoon?
I just wish everybody well with their own thought processes and their own planning, both from a diversification and a succession point of view.
Yes, same. Wish everyone well, and just to note, ensure that your budgets are realistic and that you also do have a look at that cash flow and keep on top of it. And hopefully see some people soon in person.
Look forward to
Yes, yes, quite so.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. We'll leave it there, and yeah, thanks again for taking part.